this lecture, we're going to explore User Datagram Protocol, or UDP, which comes in the UDP Datagram module that Node provides. UDP, if you're unfamiliar with it, it's part of the core P stack like TCP, and the primary difference is you can think of most TCP, HTTP connections as handshakes. You can think of one node reaching out to another, them agreeing on a protocol and sharing information between them. UDP is more like one node sending off information to another in hopes or on the assumption that that recipient might receive it. UDP is like mailing letters off to someone and just assuming that they're reading them. Whereas HTTP is more like initiating a phone call between 2 points and confirming that you're talking to each other. UDP is used often in streaming services. If you stream videos or the like, then you've likely encountered UDP. For this demo, we are going to build a very simple UDP server and UDP client. So let's start with the server. First, I'm going to create these two files. The first is touch miscellaneous udp-server.js. Then I'm going to create touch miscellaneous udp-client.js. Now that those exist, open up the server. At the top, I'm going to write a comment that this is an example UDP server, and that we're creating a UDP Datagram server listening on 6000. Next, we're going to have our dependencies. We're going to use the Datagram module. So we're going to say that dgram equals require dgram, which is how Node refers to the Datagram module. But in order to create a server, we really only need one part. We're going to say that we are creating a server, and we are going to call var server equals dgram dot create socket, and then we're going to pass it UDP4 as the specific type of UDP that it should create. Now we need to configure what should happen if the server receives an incoming connection, because the server is going to send stuff down to the client, but it still is going to receive that initial connection from the client. So we need to call server on message. We're going to provide a callback and expect back a message buffer and the sender. Now we need to do something with an incoming message, or do something with the sender who's identified. So we're going to say that the message string is going to equal message buffer to string. Then we can just log out whatever it is that they sent. Message string. Lastly, we need to start the server listening. So we're going to bind to 6000. So server bind and pass it 6000. Now let's create that client. I'm going to open up the client document, and at the top I'm saying that this is an example UDP client sending a message to a UDP server on port 6000. Again, we're just going to have the one dependency var dgram equals require dgram. We're going to create the client. Var client is going to equal dgram dot create socket UDP4. If you'll note, so far we are doing the same thing. That is because the clients and the servers for UDP are pretty much the same protocol. UDP doesn't really care about the distinction between client and server. We're creating that distinction arbitrarily here. Now we want to define the message and pull it into a buffer. Var message string is going to equal this is a message. Now we need to convert it to a buffer. So var message buffer is going to equal buffer. We're going to use that global buffer that's always available to us from message string. So that's going to say create a new buffer, instantiate a new buffer, and base it on this message string that we've had defined. Now we want to send off the message. So for that, we'll call client send. We'll send it the message buffer. We'll tell it to send it to port 6000 on the host, localhost, and then we'll expect back an error. When it calls back, we'll call client close, and that'll be it. So let's try this out. Again, I'm going to open up 2 tabs. In the first tab, I'm going to call node miscellaneous UDP server just started up. And now that it's running, I'm going to go to the other tab and call node miscellaneous UDP-client.js, which will send off this message. So it sent off that message, and then it exited because it has nothing left to do. If we go back to the server, we can see that it received and logged out. This is a message. Now you might be saying, didn't you say that in UDP these servers are sending messages down to the clients, not the other way around? Well, yes and no. Like HTTP 2, the UDP protocol doesn't much care between the distinction of client and server, as I mentioned. And so in our case, we're using a client to send a message up to the server. If we wanted to stream video down to the client from the server, we could do that just as well. Here we have used that distinction to say that the client is the thing that sends. We've just called it a client. UDP server was instantiated the same way, dgram.createSocket, and we called it a server. So that really doesn't matter. The distinction is arbitrary, and it's really just to help conceptualize the situation. So with that, we can kill this server and move on to the next lecture.